And these shall go away into everlasting punishment, but the righteous into life eternal. Matthew 25, verse 46, King James Version. This and many other verses are used to justify the doctrine of eternal damnation. Today I'm going to make three claims. First, that the doctrine of eternal damnation, if you take the word eternal and its various synonyms out of the Bible, will have absolutely no ground to stand on. It is absolutely no biblical foundation if you take that one simple word out of the Bible. Then I'm going to also show that if you keep these words in the Bible, which they should not be, that universalists could still make a case from mainstream Bible translations for universalism. And then I will also show that this should be taken out of the Bible and that it should instead be translated as age. So for starters, I'm going to be using the King James Version because the King James Version is the granddaddy of all the mainstream Bible translations, your NIVs, your ESV, your New Revised Standard Version, your New King James, all the other mainstream Bible translations. The King James is the granddaddy to them all. So the errors of the King James on this matter, though I love the King James, it has an error on this matter, are all just essentially copied and pasted into these other Bible translations with very little difference. So that will be the first thing so that's why I'm using the King James. But this is true of all the other mainstream Bible translations we're talking about. So I'm going to be talking about passages of God's judgment. And inside these passages, God's judgment on people, which of course is what hell is being described as forever, but it's not forever. So the first passage I'm going to go to is Jeremiah chapter 25, verse 9. And this is talking about God's judgment on North Israel, where it says, Behold, I will send and take all the families of the north, saith the Lord, and Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, my servant, and will bring them against this land, and against the inhabitants thereof, and against these nations round about them, and will utterly destroy them, and make them an astonishment, and hissing, and perpetual desolations. Now, even says inside the text that he will destroy them, but yet later inside the text it talks about perpetual desolations. Now, of course, this is not the correct translation, but is, King Nebuchadnezzar still attacking today? Of course he's not. So this is one example of where God's punishment, God's judgment, because this is ultimately God's judgment on Israel, is being described as being forever, but it's not forever. Then, of course, we can go to Jonah. And, of course, we all know Jonah is being judged for disobeying God, going to Tarshish or trying to go to Tarshish when he should have been going to Nineveh. And he's put into the belly of the whale or the fish for 3 days. In chapter 2, verse 6, it says, I went down to the bottoms of the mountains. The earth with her bars was about me forever. Yet hast thou brought me up my life from corruption, O Lord my God. It's describing Jonah as being in the belly of the whale forever. In fact, inside the Greek Septuagint, this is the word aionios, which is very important for later. But we all know Jonah is not being eternally punished by God. He's not eternally in the belly of the fish or the whale. Jonah, of course, eventually gets out, but yet it describes this punishment as being forever. And then we go to the New Testament. We actually have two examples inside the same book, the book of Jude. Inside the book of Jude, verse 6, it says, and this is talking about the angels, it says, and the angels which kept not their first estate, but left their own habitation, he hath reversed in everlasting chains, under darkness unto the judgment of the great day. But we all know these chains cannot be forever, because it then says that this will end on the judgment day. But yet this is described as being everlasting, but it's not everlasting. And then in verse 7 it says, even as Sodom and Gomorrah and the cities about them, in like manner, giving themselves over to fornication and going after strange flesh, are set forth an example of suffering vengeance of everlasting fire. Forgive me for my slight butchering there, but this is supposed to be an example of everlasting fire, but yet we all know Sodom and Gomorrah are not burning today. We all know if you go to the Middle East, you will not find Sodom and Gomorrah perpetually on fire, but yet there it is. It's being described as still being on fire, as an example of eternal fire, but it's not itself on fire. So that's how universalists could still make a case. That and the various proof texts for universalism, like 1 Corinthians 15, 20 through 28, 1 Colossians 1, 16 through 20, Romans 5:15 through 21, John 12:32, and many, many other verses as proof text for universalism. So even if I were to just stick to the King James and not use the Greek or the Hebrew, I could still make a case for universalism just from the old King James and any other the major Bible translations out there. I could still make a case for my beliefs. So that's my first thing. Then I'm also going to be demonstrating that this is, of course, not the correct translation. The big debate is over aion, aionios. And a lot of people, when they hear, of course, aion just means age, and aionios is the adjective of aion. And a lot of folks, this is what they say. And this is a really common objection to universalism. And it really makes me sad because I've heard like very intelligent people, like people that have been to seminary, people that know what they're talking about, raise this objection and not go any further in conversation about universalism, which I think is really sad. Like, come on, at least give us a shot. But so many people are kept from becoming a universalist by this simple argument. So they like to say that if aion, when talking about hell, means for an age, well, aion, when talking about heaven, well, does that mean our eternal life is for an age? And therefore, they like to say, well, therefore, aion, when talking about punishment, must mean forever. And this is the justification for translating aion and aionios as forever. The problem with this is, for starters, that in every other Greek context, this does not mean forever. Most scholars would agree with that in every other Greek context, this is not talking about forever. Except for, of course, they'll try to translate the church fathers as talking about forever based off the present they'll talk about into the scriptures. But in all the other Greek contexts, this does not mean forever. So that's the first problem. The next problem is that if the writers of the New Testament wanted to be more clear, they could have been more clear. So they could have not used the word aion, which of course just means age. They could have used the Greek word aidia, which means forever. And we're talking about punishment. They could have used the Greek word temeria. Temeria means retributive punishment, which is the kind of punishment that preaching of the mainstream churches. But instead, in some of these passages, the Greek word used here is kolosine. Kolosine is talking about restorative punishment, restorative justice. So that's another issue. So why weren't they more clear inside the New Testament with the words they used? If they were clearly teaching eternal damnation, which if eternal damnation is true, there should be no doubt in the Bible, but yet it's pretty much entirely absent from the Old Testament, and it's entirely absent from the writings of the Apostle Paul. And of course, we'll talk about that another day. But I mean, Paul only talks about hell once, and that's inside talking about, oh, Hades, where's your victory? And then, of course, it's missing inside the Old Testament. And if you read the sermons of the apostles in the book of Acts, it's also missing. But, there's just that massive issue that if the writers of the New Testament were going to clearly teach eternal damnation, they sure did a pretty bad job of it. Why would they even give us universalists a shot like this? Why would they even allow for us to make an argument like this? And then finally, another argument I want to point out is that the fellow who comes up with this argument is St. Augustine. I respect St. Augustine, a great mind of the early church, but St. Augustine never learned Koine Greek. So St. Augustine is the first guy who ever proposes this argument. He says, well, if it means age when talking about eternal punishment, when talking about punishment, it has to mean forever when talking about heaven. So it would have to mean forever when talking about hell. That is come up by St. Augustine, and St. Augustine only really knew Latin. So the native Latin speaker who never learned the Greek very well is the guy who comes up with this argument. But yet all these church fathers who know Koine Greek as their native language never make this argument. And that should really make you think, hold on, the guy who didn't know Greek is the guy who makes this argument, not the guy who did know Greek. Not all the people who knew Greek. So many knew Greek. Most of the church fathers were Greek, at least spoke Greek as their native language, Koine Greek. And they never made this argument. So that should really make you think. And then finally, eternal life is not a place, it is a state. There's a few places we can go to the Bible to talk about this, but for the sake of time, I'm just going to use a proof text today in the book of 1 John, one of my favorite books. Anyways, in 1 John chapter 3, 1 John chapter 3, verse 15, it says, "Whosoever hateth his brother is a murderer, and ye know that no murderer hath eternal life abiding in him." Now, this is very interesting. Eternal life is not talking about a place. It's not talking about the new heavens and the new earth in this context. Eternal life is a state of being. It's eternal life abiding in him. And if we go to places like 1 John as well, and Peter and other places, we talk about, inside the Bible, it talks about we'll become partakers inside the divine nature. which is Orthodox Christians will call it theosis. Many Protestants will call it Christification. But we will become like Christ and partakers inside his divine nature. Now, we will not become God, like the New Agers say, but we will be partakers inside the divine nature, and that's what will sustain us eternally, is partaking inside the divine nature. And I think that the Eucharist is the beginnings of this, partaking inside the divine nature now. That inside the sacraments, the other sacraments like baptism and receiving the Word are kind of the beginnings of this, and the Spirit working within us. But it's very interesting that inside the text, it talks about eternal life abiding in him. Eternal life is something that abides in him, in you. Forgive the dog. I despise it when they bark. But eternal life is something that abides in him. And, of course, the correct translation of this is age during life, age abiding life. But it is an internal state. It's something within you, which is something quite interesting to think about. It's also worth talking about that the fire is a cleansing fire, a purifying fire. The lake of fire is purifying. Sulfur fire inside the ancient world is used inside the refiner's crucible. Sulfur fire would have been talking about the purification of precious metals. And we know this from the cultural context. We can go to places like Peter, 1 Peter, it talks about this. But inside the book of Revelation itself, it actually talks about the metaphor of refining fire in the book of Revelation itself. In chapter 3, verse 18, Jesus says, I counsel thee to buy of me gold, treated in fire, that thou mayest be rich, and white raiment, that thou mayest be clothed, and that thy shame of thy nakedness. So, in the book of Revelation, Jesus is using the metaphor of being tried by fire, being refined by fire. So the fire that they say is eternal punishment is clearly a refiner's fire. The sulfur fire is a metaphor. Fire and brimstone. You always hear fire and brimstone preaching. I'm a Bible thumping fundamentalist. Fire and brimstone. Brimstone, it just means sulfur. It's an old word for sulfur. And sulfur fire is a refiner's fire, a purifying fire. And I can demonstrate there inside the book of Revelation itself that Jesus is using that metaphor. So when we're reading about people being thrown into the lake of fire, the metaphor there, of course, this is not eternal. But also there's a metaphor there that this is a refiner's fire. I would also urge you to read 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verses 10 through 15, where it talks about people being refined by fire, the foundations being burnt up, but the man being saved. I would also encourage you to read that verse as well in considering this. But the other problem with this idea of this is eternal punishment is that the metaphor here, the sulfur fire, is clearly a cleansing fire and a purifying fire. And that's what's being understood there. And anybody who would have understood metallurgy back in the day, and even today, this process is still used today, would have understood that. So those are my reasons why I don't believe hell is forever. Aion, aionios just means age. In fact, the English language is actually a few percent Greek. So we actually have a word that comes from the Greek word aion, which is the Greek word, English word eon. Eon it just comes from aion. It just means age. And usually what people try to translate as forever is aionios. In fact, remember when I talk about Jonah, when I talk about it being forever, inside the Septuagint, which is the Old Testament of the early churches in Greek, the Greek word there is aionios. And therefore, of course, the adjective aionios is describing the word aion. And I've heard scholars disagree. I've heard some scholars say that when aion or aionios is describing God, it means forever. Think about this. Think about another adjective. If I say my cat is big, we all know that I cannot mean my cat is forever big. But if I say God is big, we all know that God is infinite, so God is infinitely big. You see the difference there? But I've heard some scholars say that aion never means eternal, even when talking about God, because God transcends time. I've heard scholarly disagreement over that. But when not talking about God, aion just means age. In fact, it's really circular reasoning. Here's how pretty much it works with your mainstream Bible translation. They say the tradition says aion means eternal. And therefore they translate all those passages like Matthew 25:46 as eternal. And then, of course, they say, well, the Bible clearly says eternal. And then, of course, it's just a circle over and over and over again because the Bible informs the tradition informs the Bible, and this informs how it's translated. And it's this circle over and over again. It's pure circular reasoning. It's just tradition justifying tradition. That's it. And there's a long history of universalism inside the church. Another tradition to draw upon that I think, of course, is more faithful to the biblical text. So yeah, that's kind of my thoughts on this matter. One other thing I'd like to mention, and that is that all those proof texts for universalism I mentioned, there's many, many others. No matter what Bible translation you're reading, whether it be the King James, the NIV, the Young's Literal Translation, all these other translations, all those verses are the same. No matter what Bible translation you're reading, they're the same. But those verses about punishment, they're not the same. You read the King James, it's going to tell you one thing. If you read the NIV, it's going to tell you another. And if you read the Young's Literal, it's going to tell you another. And that's just something to think about. The verses that clearly preach universalism are the same in all these 400 translations of the Bible into English. But all these verses meant to support eternal damnation are not the same in all these different Bible translations. Just some food for thought. So forgive me for my occasional stutter and slurring of words. I hate when I do that, but it happens. But anyways, y'all have a good day. God bless. I hope you enjoyed the video. At least think about universalism. You know, so many folks, they raise that argument I talked about, like, oh, well, if punishment in hell is temporary, then life eternal must be temporary as well. And that's just one argument I made justifying that. There's much more scholarly work to be done. Many more scholars you can draw upon. I recommend the work of John Wesley Hanson, great writer. But anyways, y'all have a good day. God bless. Like, subscribe, and share. And Christ will conquer.